I want to go back, Inspector General Horowitz, to the medical care issues and say that I'm just deeply concerned about the reports that have been coming out around the issues of medical care within the private prisons and the BOP system. And last year, The Nation magazine obtained records for 103 out of 137 people who have died in BOP private prisons. Only 77 of them provided enough information to actually look at the individual cases, but the conclusions even from those reports were damning. 38 deaths that involved inadequate medical care, and inadequate medical care likely contributed to 25 premature deaths. And there are a number of cases along these lines, but one was a 41-year-old named Nestor Garay, who was at a private BOP facility operated by the Geo Group in Texas. And I mention his case in particular because his cellmates yelled for help for 30 minutes after he suffered a massive stroke. And because the doctor was not on site, he lived 45 minutes away. And ultimately, it was almost 6 hours before he went to a hospital and died. So your office has conducted several audits on this. You've mentioned it in your statement. My question to you is, what specific improvements have you actually seen and required from BOP around medical care?
So what we've seen are the reports back on whether the steps they've taken are sufficient to meet our recommendations and to close them. I'd have to go back and get specifics on what's, if any, still remain open on them. I believe there are some that are still open in some of those audits. We have not, though, gone back at this point. Everything is fairly recent in terms of our work to do any follow-up work on site, because obviously that would be a further way to assess it. But the first step is seeing if they've actually implemented. I'd add that the burden's also on the BOP, because as you know from our oversight report of what the BOP is doing, in any of the work we do, really the first line oversight is by the component who's spending the money. They're primarily the responsible. I've got 450 people to oversee 112,000 department employees. I've got a $93 million budget to oversee a $28 billion budget. So we can't be the BOP only the BOP's oversight on these, but we do make sure through our follow-up questions, through their interactions and seeing their interactions with Congress and members, whether they are in fact making the reforms that we think are critical.
One of the issues is around, and your report mentions many times, the management of costs for the prisons. But one of my concerns is that one of the ways to cut costs is by cutting services. And so, do your recommendations include things like having on-site medical professionals and not cutting costs in specific areas that would actually cause death and fewer outcomes, better outcomes for our people that are in there?
Yeah, in both our contract prison report, but also actually as to our BOP oversight for its own institutions, we've consistently expressed concern as to whether there is sufficient medical care in the contract prison situation based on the contracts that BOP has written, at the BOP institutions based on their own policies and the staffing challenges they've faced that we heard from when we were on the ground at facilities, and making sure that appropriate care is being given to inmates. That's a constitutional requirement. If you are responsible for an inmate, you've got to give them appropriate medical care, making sure that's present. What our cost-related concerns have been is, interestingly enough, we've found that BOP, alone among the federal government, is actually paying, in many instances, multiples of the Medicare reimbursement rates to care for outside prisoners. So doctors who are treating inmates are actually getting reimbursed potentially at rates higher than the Medicare rate, and therefore higher than the rates for treatment of veterans, military families, detainees, Native Americans through the Indian Health Service, all of whom are limited to the Medicare rate.
That was one of my questions. I noticed in your report that there was a work group that was supposed to be established around that. Has there been any progress made on that?
We have not received a report yet of the further progress. I can assure you we are going to continue to follow that. That's a $100 million plus cost savings potentially for the Justice Department. And there, in our view, there is no reason that the same reimbursement rate laws that apply to the Veterans Administration, the Defense Department, Homeland Security, the FBI, and the Marshal Service, by the way, within the Justice Department.
That's right. Well, I
shouldn't also apply to
urge that
DOJ.
follow-up, and I know my time is over. I'll just say that having an MD on site is, the penalties for this are actually lower than the cost of paying the doctor's salary. So it's a huge issue, and I hope that you'll stay as vigilant as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.